right, welcome back. This week we are going to be talking about child abuse and neglect. This covers chapter 6 in the textbook, and then I've added some additional material in that I hope you enjoy. I will tell you that this week is going to be a difficult week. As part of my philosophy, I want to make sure that you are well equipped should you go into any criminal justice field dealing with abuse of children. That can be law enforcement, detective work, child welfare, anything like that. So this is a trigger warning that I will be showing some pictures of actual abuse situations. We will be talking about physical abuse and burns, and some of the pictures are kind of gruesome, and I'm not doing that for shock factor. I'm doing that so that you get a good idea of what you're probably going to see should you choose to go into this subsection of the field. As always, feel free to take notes. I will timestamp this so that you can go back and re-watch any of the slides you may need. So let's start with some history of child abuse. Child abuse is not a new phenomenon. We have seen infanticide, which is murdering a child before their first birthday, for centuries. Dating back to the ancient times, children were seen as property of their fathers. Children and mothers were really property of the males of the family. And so in ancient times and in Greece, it was not uncommon for children to be killed by their parents. In fact, if they had deformities, if they were sick, things like that, they were killed. During the Roman Empire, if the child was deemed not useful to the family, as in being able to work to bring in any type of funding, things like that for the family, they were also killed. So if they were born with any type of disabilities, things like that, they were really kind of judged based on usefulness to the family and the family legacy. It really wasn't until the Middle Ages and I won't say invention of Christianity, but really kind of like the Judaism and Christianity influence into society, that we started to realize and recognize this right to life. Like everyone has the right to live. Your value to your life should not be placed on how valuable you are to the family. And so we changed our philosophy truly through the introduction of Judaism and Christianity. If you have had any of my classes before, you've probably heard this, or if you've had a juvenile justice class, you've probably heard this. But the Industrial Revolution really kind of catapulted how we treat children in the United States. We brought over a lot of philosophy from Britain, and Britain recognized this concept of parens patriae, which is the right of the king to act in the best interest of the children. So you started to see this best interest of the children philosophy starting in Britain and really kind of migrating with the new colonies and things like that. Post-industrial revolution, it was not uncommon for children to just be put on the streets. And again, where in ancient times they would be killed if they weren't useful to their family, really here we see they're put out, they're orphaned. And so as a way to really kind of address this epidemic of orphans, we created houses of refuge. And these are conceived as places of protection for children. However, they were not as they appeared. They were very prison-like and extremely rough and rigid. which kind of caused a lot of rise in delinquency and things like that. You had this movement of this time whenever we realized that houses of refuge were not um, operating as they were intended. And it's deemed as the child savers movement. And a lot of juvenile justice movements correspond with child welfare. Child welfare is relatively new as far as like child protective services and things like that, but the philosophy of child welfare is not. It dates back to post-industrial revolution. Um, the child savers movement were a group of socialite women who wanted to take care of those that were orphaned or less than. And so they took up the cause of saving children because of poverty or poor parenting. This is the first time we really kind of talk about parenting styles and things like that is during the child savers movement. These socialite ladies believed that they knew best how children should be raised. And so they started instituting mandatory schooling, kind of ushered in this philosophy of appropriate parenting. But realistically, the child savers movement was the leading change agent for how we deal with juveniles in general. Um, whenever I introduced myself, I told you I've worked in the juvenile realm. I've worked on both the delinquency side, which is the probation side, and like the legal charging side. But I've also worked on the dependency side, which is the foster care and kind of taking care of kids who are neglected or abused and things like that. And so all of that really kind of was ushered in through this child savers movement. Now, the child savers movement is highly controversial. There are those that feel like this was classism and it was a way to indoctrinate society on how children should be raised and things like that. So I'm not going to go too deep into that. Just know that there's some controversy around the child savers movement. So how did we get to where we are today, from the child savers movement, post-industrial revolution, to kind of a set foster care system, a system that tasks agencies within the state to investigate reports of abuse and neglect? Well, the Child Abuse and Prevention Act, or CAPTA as it is called, was enacted on January 31st of 1974. Essentially, CAPTA was the main child abuse legislation that sets out federal funding and to states to combat child abuse, as well as sets minimal definitions of what child abuse is. You will see that I have linked Georgia's child abuse statute in folio for you to look at. Each state has their own definitions of child abuse, but the overarching definition or the minimal definitional standards is set out by CAPTA. So each state has to incorporate these two main definition points in their state definition of child abuse. So the first is any recent act or failure to act on the part of parent or caregiver that results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation. And then an act or failure to act that presents an imminent risk of serious harm. So those are your two main definitions that constitute child abuse in the federal realm. Now, Georgia and each state kind of breaks it down a little bit. Like, we're going to talk about emotional abuse and psychological abuse. Psychological abuse was actually taken out of the Georgia definition for probably 4 years. And you weren't able to really substantiate cases on emotional abuse. You had to look at other avenues. We didn't recognize emotional abuse until probably about 2 years ago when it was put back into the language. They did a revision of the child abuse statute in Georgia and added emotional abuse back into it. So you will see that different states handle different types of abuse differently. However, every state will have something around neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, things like that. In essence, child abuse is an act or omission to act. And so this is what confuses people the most is, according to this definition, you can see it right there, that it's a failure to act. And this is where we get neglect from. And we'll talk a little bit more about neglect. But, neglect is the most prevalent form of child abuse that we see today. And I'll show you some statistics to back that up. But over 90% of my cases when I was a child abuse investigator dealt with neglect situations. And so it really wasn't your physical or sexual abuse cases or your psychological abuse cases. It really was neglect issues. And that omission to act is where we get neglect from. When we were talking about the NCBS, I got a lot of questions around, well, how do we capture victimization of children under 12? Because remember, NCBS, the National Crime Victim Survey, only captures those respondents 12 and older. We get the information on children under 12 through NCANDS. And this is the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System. It is a voluntary reporting system that was created by the Children's Bureau. And the Children's Bureau is the federal oversight agency for all state child welfare departments. And so they will ensure that CAPTA regulations are being held throughout the states. They will also gather what are called AFCARS data, which is Adoption and Safe Families Act, that kind of regulates foster care and all of that. But they also gather data through NCANDS. And the goal of NCANDS is to collect and analyze annual statistics on child maltreatment from state protection agencies. And this data is vital when you're studying child abuse because it includes children with an allegation of maltreatment, any maltreatment, whether it's substantiated or unsubstantiated. And so NCANDS data is phenomenal, and I used it for my thesis work because I could differentiate between the types of coded maltreatment. And so that's where we kind of get our breakdowns of neglect represents this amount for the year, physical abuse accounts for this amount of the year. So NCANDS is our primary data source for actual child abuse and neglect. AFCARS is the data source for adoption and foster care side. So let's look at some statistics. There are approximately 3.6 million cases reported every year in the United States of child abuse. Now, not every case is substantiated, and you've heard me say substantiated or unsubstantiated. So essentially, substantiation and unsubstantiation are child protective services dispositions of the cases that come in. Substantiation means that there's a preponderance of evidence to support that neglect or abuse happened. Unsubstantiated means that there is not a preponderance of abuse that neglect or abuse happened. And so cases come in daily just depending on the size of the counties that you're in. I was over Region 1, and so our largest county was Cherokee County, and they would get about 60 cases a day just from various reporting systems. They had around 400 kids in foster care. They were a very large county. The county that I worked in whenever I was an investigator was a Class 3 county, which meant just population size. And so we would have probably about 20 cases a week. There were 3 of us who were investigators, and we just divvied up those cases. Essentially, there are those cases that are unknown. And in fact, when we look at overall trends and data sources, we can see that for about every 1 reported incident, there are probably about 2 incidents that don't go reported. And that's staggering. You only can help the ones that you know about, and so we know that there are a lot of unreported cases of child abuse, whether there's been no disclosures or whether people have just not felt like they needed to call or someone else would call, things like that. So I did some research, and I kind of wanted you, before we talk about the different types of abuse, I wanted you to kind of get a picture in your brain about the most common and the percentages of each type of maltreatment that we really see in child welfare. So this is from Mandated Reporter website. It's the most recent data, 2024 data, or it was done in 2024. It's 2022 data, so that's the most recent data that we have. And it breaks down each category of neglect or abuse and kind of tells us how prevalent each of them were. So you will see that based on the most recent data, about 74.3% of all cases were neglect cases. And we'll talk about neglect here in a minute, what kind of constitutes neglect. 17% were physical abuse cases, 10.6% were sexual abuse cases, and 6.8% were psychological abuse cases. So you can see that the most recent data aligns with national trends throughout most current history, that neglect is the most prevalent form of maltreatment that is reported to child abuse agencies. So, who are child abuse agencies? Child abuse agencies are some of the most powerful agencies in the state. And that's kind of controversial for me to say because, there are agencies that deal with financing and things like that. But CPS, Child Protective Services, has probably one of the most powerful reaches of any agency in state government. Child Protective Services is mandated to investigate and protect victims of abuse. They are the only agency that is legally allowed to enter your home and take your children, with a court order, of course. They can't just go in there and say, hey, I'm taking your kids. Like, some people think that, but it's not. They have to have a court order. Everything is approved by a judge. But they are physically able to call a judge and say, hey, this kid needs to be removed. This is why, X, Y, and Z. They are the only agency that is allowed to do that and have been given the power to do that. there is a standard that they have to go by, and that standard, evidentiary standard, is known as a preponderance of the evidence. So the best way for me to describe preponderance of evidence is it most likely is true. 50% plus 1. I have gathered enough evidence to say this most likely occurred. I don't have to have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. I have to have evidence that says this most likely occurred. And so they yield some major power. Child Protective Services is a subsection of the Division of Family and Children Services in the state of Georgia. This agency is called different things in different states. I've heard it called DCF, Department of Child and Family, DFACS, DCS, Department of Children's Services. It's all the same entity. It's just how different states name the department. Within DFACS, there are different subsets. So you have what is called and I'm going to speak specifically to Georgia because that's what I know. In Georgia, you have the Office of Family Independence, or OFI. That's the office that deals with Medicaid, TANF, all of your government assistance programs. You then have child welfare side. And child welfare side has 2 additional subsections. Actually, no, 3 additional subsections. You have Child Protective Services, which is your investigators and all of that. You also have Family Preservation Services, who is under the CPS umbrella. You then have Foster Care Services, who take care of children who are already placed in state custody. They place them in different placements. They see them. They case plan with the families to reunify. And then you have adoption. So adoption services are those services when parents' rights are terminated, that is really a legal death to that child's roots. It's very traumatic. A lot of people don't think of it that way, but it really is. So if parents can't reunify, can't get their kids back because they can't complete a case plan, the judge has the authority to terminate their parental rights, meaning severing all legal bonds with that child. And so then that child is placed in adoptive status, and DFACS is tasked with finding that child a forever home. And so you see there are different levels and different departments within child welfare. Child Protective Services is just one of those departments. Child Protective Services was my home for many, many years until I went to a regional role, and then I started overseeing different, like the foster care side of things as well. So it can get very complicated if you're not in that system all the time. But just know that Child Protective Services is a subsection of DFACS, or the Department of Family and Children Services. It is not the whole department. So how do reports come to DFACS? How does Child Protective Services get notified to go check on a child? Contrary to popular belief, we don't have a van that we drive around the neighborhood and say, oh, that house looks suspicious, let's go knock on the door and investigate. I know that sounds crazy, but a lot of people were like, how did you even get here? DFACS has to be called to initiate a report. And so a lot of our reports come from individuals known as mandated reporters. And mandated reporters are individuals who are required by law to report suspected child abuse or neglect. There is a list in the statute that tells who is a mandated reporter. Any professional that works with a child is a mandated reporter. Clergy can be a mandated reporter and is a mandated reporter if they are told about abuse situations. One of the things that always baffled my mind was podiatrist was on that list. And if you don't know what a podiatrist is, that's a foot doctor. And so we always joked like the foot doctor's even a mandated reporter. But it makes sense because they're a doctor. And so you typically have school personnel, medical personnel, and child services personnel. So like schools, babysitters, or daycares, things like that. Now, the law is very broad when it comes to mandated reporters. They have to have a reasonable suspicion in order to make a report. That is all the threshold that they need to have, is just a reasonable suspicion. And by law, they have to report. If it comes out that they did not report and something happens, they can be held legally responsible. Prosecution, jail time has happened with mandated reporters and things like that. So mandated reporters are essential tools within the state to help monitor child safety. All right. So we've talked a little bit about this. So now we're going to kind of talk more in depth around the types of abuse or neglect. I want you to think, if we're saying that neglect is the omission to act, remember from that definition, what are some features of neglect that you might see? I want you to take a moment, pause this, take a moment and think. Neglect is the omission to act. So what does neglect look like? What are some features that you might think of? Pause this video, write a couple down, then come back. Here are some major features that we always saw and that were kind of trends that I saw in my career in child welfare. You see a lot of like medical treatment delays or injuries with no medical explanation. Inadequate supervision was one of my favorites because it was such a catch-all. So essentially, inadequate supervision is what we think of as neglect, but it's very broad. So a mom leaving her toddler in the car while she goes in and shops for an hour, and it's like 100 degrees outside. The toddler could die. That's inadequate supervision. Or mom and dad are smoking marijuana in the bathroom, and their 4-year-old gets out of the house and walks down the main highway and is found before he gets hit by a car. That is inadequate supervision. They're not watching their child in an age-appropriate style. Inadequate food, shelter, and clothing also is a feature of neglect. So if you don't have food, if you don't have appropriate housing or appropriate clothing, that can be features of neglect. I always trained new investigators that people don't live with white picket fences. You may have grown up with white picket fences, but that is not a common thing. Poverty is real, and poverty does not mean neglect. So it's very hard for new workers that come into child welfare to differentiate poverty from neglect. Truly dangerous shelters are like shelters with houses with holes in the floor and a toddler being able to crawl, or hoarder houses that have trash and all of this piled up that a toddler is walking to and picking up stuff out of the trash and putting it in their mouth. Things like that are what we're talking about, shelter issues, collapsed roofing and things like that. The biggest neglect issue that we saw in my time or through my experiences was not being enrolled in school or something called educational neglect. So we know in the state of Georgia that there are compulsory attendance policies, and you are held to that standard. And if parents don't make their children go to school and they miss a certain amount of days, that can then get turned over to Child Protective Services because, in essence, they are neglecting their child's education. And so we would have to go in and kind of see what was going on, um, see if it was like an issue of the parent thinking the child was going to school and then the child skipping, or if the parent really wasn't making the child go to school. So, and there are some family dynamics that don't put a lot of value in education, and so they don't see value in education, and therefore they don't make their child go to school. And that's where we start getting the neglect issue, just because it is against the law to not make a child attend school. All right, same thing here. What are some characteristics of abuse that you think? So we're going to look at some abusive pattern injuries and things like that. But if you said any of these, great job. I picked this picture on purpose because when we talk about abuse, we think of physical injury. You see, this child has a black eye. Um, and that is pretty much what abuse is: sexual, emotional, things like that. You A lot of these characteristics you see are injuries to a non-mobile child. If you have a 3-week-old baby that shows up with a femur fracture, and the parents say, "Oh, the baby rolled off the bed and broke its leg." Well, a 3-week-old is not able to roll. We are trained in child development, and so we kind of know these milestones as investigators that normal age would be doing. And so we know right off the bat that that doesn't make sense because a 3-week-old baby is not going to be rolling over. And so then you start seeing that, well, that's a characteristic of abuse because 3-week-olds don't have fractured femurs, or 3-week-old babies don't have broken ribs. And so you start seeing that the puzzle pieces aren't adding, like fitting together. If you have injuries on protected surfaces, so the way I always described this was, think of you in a bathing suit. If you have injuries to anything underneath where that bathing suit is covered, that's very suspicious. Um, or regular clothing. Like if you have injuries underneath where like your regular clothing would be, very suspicious. Uh, Multiple injuries in various stages of healing is suspicious. Now, I will tell you, investigators, child abuse investigators, are not doctors. We never dated bruises, and we never said what stage of healing they were in. That was left to a medical professional to tell us. They're the trained professionals that we have to rely on for that information. If there are patterned injuries, that's highly suspicious of abuse. And you'll see an example of patterned injuries here in a few minutes. Explanations are not plausible, or if they delay treatment. So I had a case where a baby had a fractured tailbone and 13 broken ribs. I think it was 13. But essentially what happened was the dad helped, mom went to work, the dad wrapped his fingers around the baby's sternum and squeezed because the baby wasn't um, being quiet. essentially is what he said. And so everywhere he squeezed, he broke the ribs behind. So it was a back fracture. So it looked like literally him wrapping his fingers and squeezing and breaking the baby's ribs, and then he slammed the baby down on his bottom, which broke the tailbone. And so the baby was obviously in pain and still crying and things like that, but the dad laid the baby back down in the bed and didn't seek medical treatment. And it wasn't for like a day that the parents sought medical treatment, because that mom got home and then started realizing something was wrong with the baby. Baby was crying and was breathing really funny, couldn't sit up whenever they tried to set them up. And so mom was the one that took the baby to the doctor. So some delays in medical treatment are very suspicious for abuse. So the first one that we're going to talk about is neglect. And we've talked about neglect a little bit, as far as neglect is the most prevalent form of maltreatment that is seen in child protective services. Neglect is defined as the failure or refusal to provide care or services for a person when there is an obligation to do so. This is your action or inaction by a caregiver. So neglect comes in all different forms. So you have educational neglect, medical neglect, abandonment, and we see neglect correspond a lot with substance abuse issues. So parents may leave a 4-year-old home alone while they go to their drug dealer's house and get high. That 4-year-old happens to get out of the house and get hit by a car. That's neglect. Then you have physical abuse, which is the use of force or threat of force that may result in physical injury, bodily injury, physical pain, or impairment. Broken bones, bruises, things like that, marks, are all physical abuse. Psychological abuse is difficult to investigate and difficult to prove, because psychological abuse is a pattern of things that you have to kind of put together to really show that true psychological abuse happened. So psychological abuse is the intentional infliction of anguish, pain, or distress designed to control the victim. It can be verbal or nonverbal. We see this a lot with domestic violence, children witnessing domestic violence. But we also see this in forms of, one of my worst cases of psychological abuse was a stepmother who could not stand one of her stepchildren. He was what we call a scapegoated child. And so she would lock him in a closet all day while his dad was at work, would give him like crackers to eat, while her children got free reign of the house, all of this nice stuff, got to eat full meals. And so finally this child disclosed what was going on, and we literally had to have multiple interviews, multiple forensic interviews, and it was the children in the house telling us what was going on that finally helped us put all the pieces together. And so that case took about 6 months to put together, because it was so difficult. And then we have sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is non-consensual sexual contact of any kind. Sexual contact with a person who's incapable to consent, and which includes minors. So remember when we talked about rape and sexual abuse as adults, we talked about that age of consent, and that whole consent philosophy. We know children can't consent legally or psychologically, really. They can't comprehend consent. And so any type of inappropriate sexual contact with a minor is considered sexual abuse. And we'll talk a little bit more about some signs of sexual abuse. So here is your forewarning. of where we're going to start actually seeing examples of abuse. This can get hard to look at, but again, I'm not trying to freak you out with it, not trying to shock you with it, but if you're going to go into this field, you need to be prepared for what you're going to see. So, here's what I'm going to do. You see this upper picture. You see that these green dots are likely places that we get bruises. Think of it when you're a child. Did you ever, like, when you're trying to learn to walk, you would probably run into things or fall over and hit your head, things like that. So, like, forehead injury, like a bruise in the middle of the forehead, is not uncommon to see in a normal accidental injury of a toddler who is trying to learn to walk, find balance, things like that. If you play outside and learn to ride a bike or learn to skate, you're going to have many injuries to, like, your legs and your ankles and things like that from falling down, like just rough housing, things like that. So this area is normal injuries, where we would consider to be normal injuries, of where we would see bruising happening on children. This area down here are your less likely injuries. So remember the bathing suit analogy. If you see injuries under clothing that's normally covered, that's where we start to get a little suspicious. So you will see here inside of the thighs, or upper, lower, like back area right on your tailbone, or anywhere on your back is typically indicative of suspicious bruising. Bruising under your arms, like in your armpit, is suspicious. Any bruising on your neck is suspicious. I will also add cheeks or the lower facial areas are suspicious. And where we see this is like when parents grab their child's face and like pull it or hold it real tight. You'll see slap marks. I think you'll see slap marks here in a minute. You see a lot of physical injuries from like parents slapping their children, punching their children, things like that. This over here is a better representation of where we see major abusive injuries. I would be suspicious if you had 2 black eyes and a bruise on your cheekbones. So if you fall and hit your forehead, I can understand that. If you get hit by a ball, you typically have 1 black eye, unless you've broken your nose. Then you would have a broken nose and probably raccoon eyes. But if none of that happened, and you show up with 2 black eyes and bruises on your cheeks, that's going to be highly suspicious. Notice here as well, if you have bruising inside your ear, that is very indicative of abuse to a newborn or toddler. I have seen where parents would grab the ear and it causes bruising inside the ear and on the back side of the ear. Bruising on the stomach, inside the fold, like inside the arms. You can kind of see back of the head bruising, buttocks bruising, back bruising. All of these areas are highly indicative of abuse. All right, let's go to our next one. Now this is where it gets a little hard because these are real pictures, but it gives you a great indication of what I'm talking about. Here you will see, in the picture to the left, you will see an individual who has bruising on the protected surfaces, the chest, but you should also notice that there are patterns to this bruising. So you will see like these marks are looped, which is indicative of either like a hanger, being beaten with a hanger, or being beaten with a belt, like a thick belt. You also see this mark going here, which tells me this was probably a belt. Like they looped the belt here, and then the child probably tried to get away, and so the belt unlooped, and the person was just tossing the belt, so the belt wrapped around them. So you can see these injuries are highly suspicious of abuse. I didn't see the rest of this. There's a neck brace up here, so I'm assuming there may be some neck damage as well. Over here, you're going to see a baby. You're going to see the inside right here, and hopefully you can see this, but these are bite marks. And this is very common. I say very common. I had several of these type of cases. So what would happen was the 2 or 3 year old, I would say this was younger, probably like 1 or 2, because you can see the baby teeth kind of coming in. But they would bite their parent, and so the parent would bite the child back to show them that it wasn't okay. But this is abuse. This is considered physical abuse. You can see this is an adult like mouth here. You can see the upper teeth and the lower teeth here. And obviously it's on the inside of the arm, so you can see kind of the injuries that we're talking about there. We're going to talk about burns, and I don't think I put in any like major burn. No, I didn't. Okay, I just put in some kind of illustrations of burns because burns make me sick. Like just that's the one that makes me physically sick, is seeing skin kind of falling off. So I didn't want to subject you to that. But different burns and different marks from burns indicate physical abuse. Now, there can be accidental burns. If think of like a child pulling down a pot of hot water, that might not be physical abuse. That might be indicative of neglect. Like parents walked away and left the child unattended so that child could reach, and so you're going to see like splash marks going down the child. We're going to start out though with cigarette burns. I've had a couple of cases of cigarette burns. And so essentially you can see these round burns on the surface of the skin. So wherever the person puts the cigarette out on the child is where you're going to see the burn. This one just happens to be the hand, so you can see there's probably been 3 times that a cigarette has been put out on a child. You see it's pustule, so that's probably relatively new-ish. But you can kind of see they're very circular, and they have a ring on the outside to them like that. They don't kind of like, they're not splash marks or anything like that. The next is an iron. You can see the actual formation of the iron on this baby's back. And so you can kind of see that the parent probably just put or the babysitter or whoever did the abuse, put the iron on the back of the child. Here's some more burn marks, and these are just mark patterns. And so think back to earlier when we were talking about this, but different objects will leave different patterns that we look for. And so, as I showed you in the picture earlier of the belt marks, you could see the physical patterns on that child. Burns are no different. And so you will see different indentations. So like curling iron will leave this cylinder shape. Cigarettes leave these little circular marks. Immersion burns are more common. And immersion burns are essentially when the child has been immersed in hot water or something to burn them. And you will see actual linear kind of where it cut off, like how deep the child was put in. Everything below a certain line that was immersed in the substance will be burned and will have severe burns to it. Here's a little bit more about immersion burns. And what we see with immersion burns is you will see, depending on what it was, I had a baby that was put in a hot pot of water, like immersed in a hot pot of water. And so the burns looked a lot like this. So you will see that if this child, let's say this is the child, this child was put up in a bathtub, scalding hot bathtub, and you would expect to see burns everywhere that's been underwater, right? You don't always see that. There will be places where this child was folded up. So like they were put in a seated position, so not all of their skin was subjected to that scalding water. Where they were seated and crunched up, it protected some of the skin. So you will see some protections like along here, the stomach, the pelvic region where they were bunched up. On the buttocks as well, if everything around the buttocks is burned, that tells me that the child was made to sit somewhere because the bathtub itself protected the water from getting to this area. So you see a lot of like what are called zebra striations with immersion burns. So abuse can lead to death. And child fatalities are some of the worst cases that anyone would ever have to work. Whether you're law enforcement, whether you're child welfare, these cases take a toll on you. There are roughly 16,070 children that die every year in the United States, and it's typically at the hands of their parents. There are some major risk factors for death, and we see the majority of these deaths being children under 1 year of age. So infants are at the highest risk of death. And then if parental substance use is an issue, you typically will see death as well. I can tell you my first case right out of the academy, the Child Welfare Academy for DFACS, my first case was a child death. It was a 1-year-old child. He died the Friday before his birthday was going to be on Sunday. His stepfather strangled him to death while his mother took his siblings to school. And mom came back and found the child. That case still haunts me to this day. I've worked several child death cases, and I was a child death specialist, which meant that I got called in on all of those cases to kind of handle them, just because those cases take a little bit more time and attention. And from the child welfare side, it kind of takes more partnership with law enforcement, GBI, things like that. But those are the hardest cases. It takes a team approach. Every month we have what's known as a child fatality review. in every county in our state. Actually, I would say probably every judicial circuit. Some judicial circuits will cover multiple counties, but that is where partners who deal with children come together and kind of staff the case. It's a multidisciplinary team, so we kind of tell what happens between each of our agencies, and then we turn that into the state as the case closes, and the state tracks those child fatalities from that. So what do we know about perpetrator-victim dynamics in child abuse cases? Well, let's start with the perpetrator. So we know that the majority of perpetrators in child abuse cases are between the ages of 18 and 44, and more than half of them are women. A lot of times we think of it as men, but the data shows us that over 50% of the perpetrators are women, and most of them are the mothers. Victim dynamics show us a lot. So infants are most frequently victims of neglect. Children under 1 are most likely to be victims of abuse. Whenever you are in the potty training phase of development, that is the highest risk phase of physical abuse, just because tensions are running high. Girls are a little higher likely to be victims than boys, but it's not by much. So gender doesn't really kind of alleviate anything. It's a little bit higher, not much. But when we look at ethnicity, we see that white non-Hispanic children are about 44% of the victims, and Hispanic are 22%, and black children are right at 22% as well. So you see that there's about a 19-20% difference between ethnic classes, but you see that white children are typically more likely to be victimized. All right, so I'm going to be fully transparent. I hate talking about sexual abuse with children. This is my least favorite subject to talk about, just because it's some of the most traumatic stuff that I've witnessed in my career, but we will get through this. So, child welfare agencies use different levels of legal evidence to make decisions. Remember, our standard of proof is a preponderance of evidence. Child sexual abuse takes on many forms, both within the family and outside of the family. Sexual abuse or sexual assault on a child is any forced, exploitive, or coercive sexual contact or experience with a child. And so you're going to see these examples. The statute on sexual abuse is very clear around types of actions that constitute sexual abuse. So you have molestation, rape, voyeurism, exhibitionism, forced prostitution, pornography. You also have incest, and we've talked about incest a little bit, but incest refers to any sexual activity between persons who are so closely related that their marriage is illegal. So like parent-child, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, things like that. Siblings. The majority of incest cases that I have seen have been parent-child. However, I have seen several childhood sibling cases of incest, but we know that there is more going on that's reported. Sibling incest is considered widespread, but it's rarely reported, and it's often chalked up to child development. So it's not sometimes it cannot be taken as serious as it truly is. there are certain signs and symptoms that we look for whenever investigating sexual abuse. There are certain signs that victims will give, and behavior changes that are indicative of potential sexual abuse. So if a child has not been sexually acting out before, but an event happens and then the child's behavior changes to start being more sexualized, sexually acting out, touching, things like that, that can be a telltale sign that something may be going on. Excessive masturbation is another common symptom that we kind of look at as a potential probability of sexual abuse, especially if that wasn't an issue before. But even if it becomes an issue that is not developmentally appropriate, so if you're having like an 8-year-old excessively masturbating, there's something there. Typical 8-year-olds don't know what that is. Or if there's unusual interest in or avoidance of sexual anything, they can shut down, things like that. You also start seeing bedwetting. You start seeing nightmares, depression, or over aggressiveness and suicidality. And you start seeing a refusal to kind of go to school or get out of their room, essentially. They don't want to get out and be exposed to potential sexual abuse going on. You also see reaction to the perpetrator changing. So we know that the majority of child sexual abuse is someone that the child knows. It's not the stranger with the candy truck or anything like that. It's typically someone they know. And so if they had a loving relationship before, that they were excited to see this person, and then all of a sudden they shut down when they even see this person, or like they shut down, get really nervous, and like urinate on themselves, something like that, then those are very telltale signs that something has happened. So there is a clinical diagnosis known as sexual abuse accommodation syndrome that is out there. But essentially, we use this to kind of explain the phases that a child goes through who has been sexually abused when kind of dealing with their experience. So the first phase is the secrecy phase, kind of no one can tell, being sworn to secrecy, something like that. You then see helplessness and entrapment kind of going hand in hand. So they can't tell anybody. They're afraid to tell somebody. It continues to happen. They feel like they can't do anything to stop it. And then you start seeing accommodation. So like they come to expect it. They don't try to stop it, things like that. Then you start seeing the disclosure phase. So there may be delayed disclosure, so you might not find out until they're teenagers that they were sexually abused preteen years, or they might have conflicting stories. And this is where my frustration always happened with the system, because if you didn't have a good disclosure, that victim credibility went out the window, and so law enforcement wouldn't prosecute those cases or bring those cases to the prosecutor. And so these cases were very frustrating to me, because a part of understanding the victimology of sexual abuse victims is understanding that retraction is a part of this. and especially if Child Protective Services is involved, because we typically remove a child out of this. And so the child has been victimized by most likely a family member, and is being victimized by the system because we pull that child out of that home, and all they want to do is go back home. And so retraction is typically a part of this process. And that makes it very muddy for the legal side of things because the credibility issues go out the window. And so this is a fine line that we continually have to talk about when we're working with child sexual abuse victims, because we have to understand that recantation, retraction, all of that is common. You have seen the video from the Teal House, who is our Child Advocacy Center. The Child Advocacy Center model is a model that's utilized in pretty much all of child welfare. And it's been adopted nationally and internationally as a promising approach to treating child sexual abuse victims. And there's some major components to this CAC model. So one is using the multidisciplinary team approach. So you bring in law enforcement, you bring in the child advocates, you bring in DFACs, you bring in school system, all of that to kind of help progress the investigation and be there and be a support to the child. You use videotaped interviews, and that child is interviewed by a trained forensic interviewer. So you've heard the Teal House kind of talking about forensic interviewers being trained. There's international certification for forensic interviewers that those individuals go through to kind of learn how to talk to kids and how to navigate these disclosures to get them to be as legally sound as possible. And the final component is the specialized forensic medical examiners. So SANE nurses are now involved with CACs, and we've talked about SANE nurses. They're there to do the medical examinations on children who may need them. But essentially the CAC model is foundationally built upon support. So you have the victim advocate, you have support programming, mental health treatment that is all encompassing in this one location for this victim. And the CAC model is a great model. I've been a part of them my entire career. They work. We don't always agree in the multidisciplinary team approaches, because we all come at it from a different angle, because we all come at it from a different lens of what part of the investigation we're doing. But the CAC model is a great model that we continue to utilize. Almost done. So this is the last thing that I wanted to kind of make sure that I highlighted. There are a couple of theories on why child maltreatment occur that your book goes through. The first one is the intergenerational transmission of violence. And this is one that I really kind of am an advocate for, I guess you could say. In my practitioner experience, this is the one that I've seen the most. And intergenerational trauma or intergenerational transmission and social learning theory kind of goes together. But essentially, intergenerational transmission says that child abuse and neglect lead to more violent and criminogenic behaviors developing in children. And it also talks about how if you witness or are a victim of child abuse, you're more likely to become an abuser. There are generational trends through different families of how they use discipline, and more harsher the discipline, the more likely we're kind of setting that social okay that this continues throughout our family. Social learning theory kind of goes along with that. So it kind of measures the parent aggressiveness and kind of says that children learn through their parent interactions. And so parents are essentially teaching them that expressive behavior is normal and justified, and that aggression is permissible to deal with issues. Another theory is the ecological theory. The ecological theory essentially says that there are certain patterns in a child-parent relationship that could be indicative of future child maltreatment. And so those four are listed on the slide here. And there's a lot of validity to this. As a practitioner, I've seen this. Scholarly research has also kind of upheld some of this. But essentially, we see inappropriate parental expectations of the child. So we call it parentification, where the child is expected to be the parent and take care of the parent, or the child is expected to be the parent of the siblings. You see a lack of empathy and a belief in physical punishment are more likely to kind of lead down to child maltreatment. And then finally, there was a thought pattern around psychopathology. This has been disproven. There really wasn't a consistent profile of parental psychopathology that said that more of these type of psychological profiles are likely to be child maltreaters. However, they did find that maltreaters were anxious, tended to be anxious, and not have a real outlet to express that anxiety. All right, that was a lot of material. This is a really long presentation. Again, this is going to be timestamped, so feel free to go back and forth as you need to. If you need me, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great day.